There are now 9 of us here, so 10 with me, 11 with Catherine. Today we're going to be talking about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. And can you hear me? Okay. All right. I want you to think about a journey that you have had, your most memorable journey. Where were you headed and why? And what happened to make the journey memorable? Anyone want to begin? I know Anne's had a whole lot of journeys.
I guess talking about weather, I remember, I feel like I was 16. I hadn't been driving very long, and we were driving out. It's like West Texas, like past, I think it passed like Amarillo and everything in it, which somewhere out there. And that's, you're kind of on the plateau, but you see all the stuff around you. And you saw like, you were going to hit this sheet of rain. And sure enough, we got into it, and I had the windshield wipers on as fast as I could, and was just, just straining to see everything. And I think my mom was in the front seat. And at a certain point, we finally got through it, and she's like, "Oh, I'm glad you were driving with your young eyes." And it's like, there were times I couldn't see. So I don't know. That's what came to mind.
Well, we've had so many journeys, but I think one of my very favorite was a long time ago. We went with the kids on New Year's Eve to Austria
Oh, wow.
and landed, and it was cold and raining, and we went to Salzburg and then went to Vienna, and still it was just cold and raining. And all of a sudden it started snowing, and we had light snowflakes. But then we took the train back to Innsbruck, and as we went back, it had snowed in those areas very heavy, and there were 4-foot drifts on the roofs, and something I had never seen. And it was just amazing. But we had a wonderful time. Kent and the kids skied, and I took a sleigh ride.
Sounds wonderful. Yeah, Cynthia and I were in Vienna, and it was cold and rainy the day we were there.
You had your foot in that sock, remember?
Oh,
In that
yeah.
bra-
I had a boot as usual.
Your foot was all wet.
It was soaking wet. Yeah.
Everybody who says something, I think of a different story.
Yeah.
But I think my most memorable one was Jack was 3, and my husband, Alan, had a work trip to DC. And I said, "Oh, wouldn't this be fun if Jack and I just, hopped along and joined him? The hotel's paid for, and we could just go sightsee in DC." Youthful me. So Alan flies direct to DC on like first class. Jack and I fly coach with stopovers. And every time we were on the ground, we had to sit in the plane for at least 45 minutes with delays. And Jack was at a pinching, biting, kicking, and hitting stage, which only lasted about 10 years, so it was quick. And I sat there next to him on the plane, and the entire right side of my body was bruised from ankle to neck from him just poking me, pinching me, biting me, hitting me. And so at one point I got up and I went to the restroom and just hung out there for 10 minutes because I needed a break. And I came back and he's standing up, pressing the call button, and every flight attendant on the plane is surrounding him. Like there was no place for him to go. And then when we land in DC, and they finally say, "Okay, you can walk about the cabin because it's still going to be another 20 minutes or so." So I let him loose, and he's running up and down the aisles, and everyone's saying, "Hi, Jack. Hi, Jack." I'm like, "How do you all know his name from me yelling it so much on the plane?" And they said, "No, it was from when they said it over the PA system." And then Alan picks me up and he's like, man, I got the rental car and I had to wait for you guys for like 20 minutes because of the delay. I'm like, huh, you poor thing. That was a memorable trip. The time we were in DC wasn't much better. So
Lots of trips.
Anyone online want to tell about a memorable journey?
Yeah, I have a good fun story. One year with Eltrus, I had won a raffle for a week at a condo in Cozumel. So Mike and I invited his best friends from the DC area, who I found out at that time she was a high school principal and heavily involved in the community, and they had never actually been on an actual vacation. So we come into town, into Cozumel, and all of the main street coming from the airport is blocked off with these barricades. And we're looking at each other, and the driver says, how wonderful, of course, he says it in a very heavy Spanish accent, how wonderful that we could be here for the carnival and the parade. Did we come in just for that? And we're just looking at each other, and we realize that it's Lent. And so they get in and they have the big carnival. And we went to a restaurant I had been to before, except when we walked in, all of the tables near the street had reserve signs on them. And we said, oh, and he said, are you here for just dinner or drinks? And we said, for dinner. And he said, oh, come with me. So he took us to the very front of the restaurant, right on the street, and removed the reserve thing. We were there for like 3 hours, but the carnival was like, I mean, the street and everything was like probably 8 feet from our table. So when they're throwing beads and all this other stuff, I mean, they're landing in our margaritas. But the whole week was Carnival Week. And then that week, that Wednesday, this was on, I guess, a Monday night. I don't know. I don't remember my days. But that Wednesday was Ash Wednesday. And it was also our anniversary. And so they had arranged for the chef at the condo had an outside patio there and grilled us fresh snapper or some kind of fresh fish on the grill. And we had champagne. So we just thought it was going to be a wonderful little holiday Mexican weekend. And then to find out all of this, and you talk about celebrating, Easter week and all that, boy, they know how to do it big time in Mexico. So
That's neat. Neat
yeah,
story.
yeah.
Anyone else? It's hard to beat that.
It is really
Okay.
Karen and I have been on several trips together. They've all been wonderful with their husbands. But the one that stands out in my mind was when we went to Costa Rica. And we signed up for all these adventures that we didn't know we were signing up for. And when we wanted a zip line, we all wanted a zip line. So we got there and it was called Extreme Zip Line. I never seen it ever zip line before. And it was like 10 stations or something crazy
12 or
like that.
something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And each one of them was a little higher up and you had to climb all these stairs and it was frightening. It was raining and it was like 4 or 5 days before I found out I had my meningioma. And so I really felt horrible. And then being on that zip line in the rain, it was awful. And finally, one of the guys said, would you like for me to ride with you? And I went, yes. And so once he took control, I was fine. But I mean, I ran into the thing that held you up, hit me in the head. I mean, it was terrible. But then another journey wasn't even a journey just from our house to downtown Dallas on our anniversary one year. Jimmy arranged for us to go to this hotel, and he told the kids to not let me go anywhere because he sent a limo for me, and he knocked on my door, and I said, "Oh, you must be here for the prom. That girl lives down there." And he said, "No, ma'am, I'm here for you." So he took me. I had no idea where we were going. My directions were, don't pack anything except what you need for Craig's baseball game tomorrow. So I did that, and I got to the hotel, and he wasn't there. And I went in the room, and there was new clothes all over the bed. There was what I was supposed to wear that night, and a new outfit for sleeping. And And it was just right after I had seen Pretty Woman.
So you felt like Pretty Women? Well, you were being wined and dined. Ellen, you have a journey you want to tell us about?
Oh, I don't know which one.
I know.
Yeah. So I would probably have to say the pilgrimage to Geneva and Iona when it was, there were 15 of us, and it was the time that the first of all, they had these huge storms. We had a huge delay. We missed flights for overseas. We ended up not going to Geneva. We ended up going to Heathrow. Then we have to split the group and go to Paris and then Geneva. Never mind, the Olympics were in Paris. And when we were in Paris, that's when the worldwide Microsoft glitch happened. And half of us never got to Geneva. Half of us did. And the other half went back to Edinburgh on a train because we didn't trust the planes by then. And then they didn't have reserved seats on the second half, and people would keep bumping them out of their seats. And I was the lead on this trip, and it was after my dad died, and I thought I was going to just be able to go on the trip and not lead. And anyway,
Silly you.
it was a very meaningful. I mean, then there was all the sites. It was the Reformation of the church and all that. It was very meaningful, but it was meaningful also in all of the glitches because we're pilgrims. And it really did change the way I go through life. And that is that I go through life as a pilgrim. And so whatever happens, there's a person before me, there's whatever, and the invitation to be changed by them. So it was very formative, but it was not very easy. Meanwhile, Iona was absolutely heaven.
Well, my favorite or my best trip was to Turkey and Greece. That was an amazing trip. It was amazing to see all the places that you have only read about, so that when you read about them again, you have that picture in your mind. And there were just so many places along the way. But some of the best part was the people who went with us. We enjoyed it so much. Ellen and Chris went along, but also Jamie Clark Souls, who was a huge part, in my opinion. But it was a wonderful trip, a learning trip and growing trip. So it will always stick in my mind. That's the best. Catherine, do you have one to tell?
I don't really have one that comes to mind. Yeah, those are, well, the most recent one that I have in mind is over winter break, my family went to Colorado and we went skiing and we drove back all in one day. And so we left in the morning and it's just beautiful, all the mountains and the snow, and there ended up being a highway closure, so we ended up going all like through the back roads, like through like the country, but like in Colorado. We're like, whoa. And we're 30 minutes from home and it's night and it had been snowing and icing and we're like, oh, we're so close. And then somebody T-bones himself onto the back of our car because he had slid on the ice and crashes into us 30 minutes from home. And so that was when, by the time we finally got home, we were like, haha,
Yeah.
we're glad we're here.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
Well, that was very memorable.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start out by reading Luke 9:51. If someone would look that up.
I'm on Luke 9. Let me check 5:51.
51.
Okay, you go on. Wait. Oh.
I just happen to have it. Samaritan opposition. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village.
Okay,
Was that it?
yes.
Okay.
40% of Luke's gospel, 10 chapters, has in its setting Jesus' journey to Jerusalem that will end in his death. Why do you think Luke devoted so much of the gospel to narrating the journey?
It's all about the journey,
Pardon me?
because it's all about the journey.
It's all about the journey. All right, let's open with a word of prayer. Faithful God, your son Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, where he would accomplish the work of salvation. As we study incidents from his journey to the holy city, may your Spirit show us how we may more closely and faithfully follow him, caring for the kind of people for whom he cared, and demonstrating your power to heal, to seek, and to save until we come by his grace to praise you in the New Jerusalem forever. Amen. Okay, Catherine, would you show the video?
Well, welcome to session 4 of our study of the Gospel of Luke and the book Luke, Jesus and the Outsiders, Outcasts and Outlaws. And I really want to encourage you not only to read the book, but to read the Gospel of Luke. And once more, I'd like to invite us to go to God. You put your hands on your lap like you're open to receiving something from God, and let's pray. God, we thank you for everything. We thank you for your love, our lives, for the gift of Scripture, and for Jesus. Open our ears to hear and our hearts to receive all that you have for us today. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'm curious if you have ever felt like the outsider. Probably most of us have at some point in our lives. You know, moments where we feel like we don't fit and where other people seem to make us feel like we don't fit and don't want to be around us. Have you ever been around people you were uncomfortable with and might have made them feel a little bit like you were an outsider? There is a tendency in us as human beings to find people who are most like us and to associate primarily with them. So when we look in the Gospel of Luke, what we find is there are people who are the outsiders, they are the outcasts, and are folks who literally are separated off from the rest of the Jewish people. And we're going to talk about a couple of those categories of people in today's study of chapter 4. 40% of the Gospel of Luke, the setting of it is a journey that Jesus is taking from the Galilee to Jerusalem. And it's the final journey he's going to take, and he's going to be crucified at the end of that. This is the Sea of Galilee right here. This is the Jordan River that flows into the Dead Sea down here. Nazareth is right here. So Jesus has grown up in Nazareth. He spent most of his time around the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is right over in this area over here. The Holy Land at the time of Jesus is divided roughly into 3 parts. You have in the north the Galilee. You have in the center Samaria. And you have in the south Judea. Jerusalem, the holy city, is right here. Jericho's over here. Samaria was for the Jewish people in the first century. This is where the Samaritans lived. The Samaritans were the people who were left behind when the Babylonians took the Jewish people into exile into Babylon. And then the Babylonians, their way of conquering a land was to transplant people that they'd conquered somewhere else and relocate them. And if you relocate people and they intermarry, they lose their identity and their culture. And so the Samaritans were the people who were intermarrying between the Jewish people and the people who'd moved from somewhere else in the Babylonian Empire. And they believed that they were still holding on to the true faith. The Jewish people considered the Samaritans half-breeds. They would use that term to describe the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, again, looked at the Jews in much the same way. By the time of Jesus, that dislike had really heightened. And so they would taunt each other and do things to each other. And if you were a Jew, let me just show you on the map. If you were a Jew and you were heading to Jerusalem and you lived in the Galilee up here, as Jesus is getting ready to do, he's heading to Jerusalem for the Passover. The fastest way would be down the way of the patriarchs over here. It's a highway along the mountain ridge, and you climb the mountains and come down, but it's the fastest way to ultimately get to Jerusalem. But if you were afraid of the Samaritans, or you thought they'd be a bad influence, or you didn't like them, then what you did is you traveled over here, and you crossed the Jordan River, and you traveled down this way, and then you came over by Jericho, and you finally came to Jerusalem. The way almost all of the Jews, not all of them, but almost all the Jews went was to travel across the Jordan River, come down and come back. It's interesting. Jesus is here in the Galilee area. He says, I have to go to Jerusalem. He started to go right down here. Now he got here, and there was a Samaritan village on the border between Samaria and Galilee, and the Samaritans didn't like what Jesus was doing as a Jew coming through their territory, and they resisted him and didn't let him into their town and spend the night. So because of that, he ends up ministering in this area for a while, and then he finally comes across and he comes down here. He ends up coming through across the Jordan River because he had to, came back through Jericho, and then that's where we're going to end this chapter in this study today. We're going to end up in Jerusalem in the next session. As we're walking through here, we find a lot of amazing things that happen in these sections. And I want to talk about some of the others that Jesus is reaching out to and caring for. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus is in ministry, and he comes across a man with leprosy. Now, leprosy today we think of as something called Hansen's disease. First century leprosy may have been Hansen's disease sometimes, but it might have also been a whole host of other skin afflictions. But people were terrified of them. They were afraid that you could become infected by them, and some of them were infectious. And so people tended to stay away from lepers. If you go back to the book of Leviticus, you find that it was a requirement. So this is in Leviticus, you don't have to look it up, Leviticus 13, 45, and 46. And in this passage, the law commands you, if anybody has leprosy, you are to tear your clothing, leave your hair disheveled, and you are to say to people with your hand over your mouth, so there's no chance you'd breathe on them, unclean, unclean. And you're to stay as far away as possible from everyone else among your people. You were forced to live outside of your town or your community, and in what today would have been called, or in the last century, leper colonies. They were outsiders and outcast, not allowed to come back home. They were desperate to be healed. And in Luke chapter 5, verse 12, we read this. Jesus was in one of the towns where there was also a man covered with a skin disease. When he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged, Lord, if you want, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. Now, if you thought leprosy was a highly contagious disease, you don't reach out and touch somebody who has it. And then Jesus said to the man who said, Lord, if you want, you can make me clean. Jesus says, I do want. Be clean. And instantly the skin disease left him. Jesus ordered him not to tell anyone. Instead, Jesus said, go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as Moses instructed. And this will be a testimony to them. And news of that spread, throughout the land, and people began to come and wanted to be healed by Jesus or touched by Jesus. I love that picture of what Jesus does there, especially the idea of touching the leprous man. We all have fears inside of us. And I think for the average person in Jesus' day, there was a fear of people who had the skin disease. They would not have wanted to do this. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes you don't want to, there are diseases where you shouldn't be touching without gloves, you shouldn't be breathing without a mask, and we learned that from COVID as well. But I was thinking about this story when I was the associate pastor in this church. So occasionally I would preach in this chapel where we're sitting. I was associate pastor for 2 years here. And I shared this with the congregation here not long ago, but I was going to visit, I was making a pastoral call on a man in the congregation this is 1988 or 1989, and he was dying of HIV. He was dying of AIDS. And I went to see him, and I was a little afraid. It wasn't highly known. The researchers had said you're not going to catch HIV or AIDS by breathing the air of somebody else. You're not going to catch it by touching somebody else. This is bodily fluids that are exchanged that lead to this. But I think most people were pretty terrified. There were a lot of people who were alienated, isolated, outcasts, outsiders. And so anyway, I was going to see this man because we'd gotten word that he was dying. And I didn't know him very well, but I went to see him, and I got to the hospital, St. Luke's Hospital, not far from here. And there was a sign outside his door, masks and gloves required. There were masks and gloves there. And so I got the mask and glove, and I put it on as I'm walking in the room. I think this is how it happened. And I was watching the doctors and nurses, and they, all had their gloves and their masks on. And I went and sat next to the man. And we began to talk. And I said, I came here as your pastor. I just want you to know that Jesus is walking on this journey with you. And as I was sitting there, or maybe standing by the door, it was this story in Luke chapter 5 that came to my mind. That Jesus didn't put on gloves and he didn't put on a mask. He just went and touched the man. And as I sat there next to the bed, I said, would it be okay with you if I took off my gloves and just held your hand for a little while? And he said, that would mean so much to me. Nobody's touched me, a human touch, since I've been in the hospital. It's always through the gloves. And I was scared, honestly. I'll just be, I was 23 years old, and I'm like, I don't really understand this yet. But what I do understand is that Jesus reached out and touched the leper, and he wanted him to feel his touch. And so we held hands there for about 20 or 30 minutes. And we talked about his life story, and we talked about Jesus' love for people, and talked about God's mercy and what heaven might be like. And then I anointed him with oil, and we gave him to Jesus. And it takes something to overcome your fear of the other, or to overcome somebody who is sick, or to overcome, it takes some courage and it takes some faith to be able to do that. And that's what I see in Jesus. He cared about the lepers. These were the ultimate outcasts. So that leads me with just one last story that I want to mention, and this is in Luke's Gospel. It's in chapter 17. Jesus is once more confronted with some folks. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and he's confronted with folks that are afflicted with leprosy. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 men with a skin disease approached him. Keeping their distance from him, they raised their voices and said, Jesus, Master, show us mercy. When Jesus saw them, he said, go show yourselves to the priests. As they left, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw that he had been healed, returned and praised God with a loud voice. He fell on his face at Jesus' feet and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus replied, weren't 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? No one returned to praise God except this foreigner. Then Jesus said to him, get up and go. Your faith has healed you. Once more, Jesus cares about the leper, but he also cares about the Samaritan. We often sometimes experience God's grace and his healing touch and whatever else that God gives to us, but we get so busy we just keep going and we never stop to say thank you. The goal in this story is for us to make sure we're not like the 9, but like the Samaritan leper who recognizes God's grace and who cry out to him, thank you. He fell on his knees and said thank you. And when I think of what worship is and what prayer is, if you could summarize the essence of worship and the essence of prayer, it's 2 words. Thank you. And that's how we're meant to live our lives every day. Thank you, God, for everything. It's why we've started every one of these sessions. God, thank you for everything. Thank you for my life. Thank you for your love. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for your grace. I offer myself to you. Let's make that our prayer as we close this session too. Would you bow with me? God, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for loving the outcast, for seeing them. Thank you for loving the outsiders, for loving them, caring for them, welcoming them, healing them. All of us watching this video and in this room have been the outsider at times. We've sometimes been the outcast. We've sometimes been excluded, quarantined by other people, made to feel like we were unseen and uncared for. But you see us and you care for us. Help us, O Lord, not to be part of the problem, but part of the solution in bringing people together, taking away the divisions, and demonstrating your love to all. In your holy name, amen.
Since we are really just one group here and one group here, I think we maybe could just discuss this all in together, if that's all right with you.
Sounds good.
Okay, what stood out to you from the video session? Anything in particular?
Doesn't add much that wasn't in the chapter.
Yeah. I think what was different.
Well, it's kind of interesting when I was reading about this and looking at the question about who would be outcasts in our society. And I actually thought back to the period of time when AIDS was, we didn't know much about it and it was a pretty scary thing. And those people were outcasts, very definitely.
I remember talking about AIDS and about that time in the late 80s, 1980s.
Mhm.
was when I started volunteering at work, and someone came to speak at one of our training sessions, and they had us go around and introduce ourselves to everybody in the room and shake hands with them. And then they said to sit down, and that we probably in a group, not necessarily that group, but a group that size, would have been shaking hands with someone with AIDS. Just to bring it to mind.
Yes, it's
It
sobering.
was-
I know when I was in nursing school, we were taught the importance of touch, not just for, all patients, of course, to form that relationship with them, but also you think about people, the elderly at that time who were isolated, or someone who might have a mental illness. I mean, you can go on, but touch is so, can't think of a word. It just means so much to humans. And I'm not talking sexual or anything like that. It's kind of like what he did, just a human touch.
It acknowledges your humanity.
Yes.
It's so very important.
I think something comes to mind when, like in reading this chapter this week and thinking about it, we think about some of these extreme, but there's an organization called Days for Girls. And one of the things that was, I guess, shocking to me, they make feminine hygiene sheets or kits for girls that are washable and whatever for these underdeveloped countries. And it started off because the girls were not able to attend school during their period. So you take a week off, every month, and how much you miss. But then as the founder of it was showing videos and where she had visited a lot of these countries, in a lot of these very rural areas of these countries, there was no education about what was going on. And they thought these women were encountering evil spirits every time they had a menstrual cycle. There was no correlation between that and reproduction. So, like, there was one family, they had already lost a daughter because they would make the girls go out during that time and stay like out in the stables with the animals and like amongst the hay, and then they would throw the hay away, or they would have to get out of sight of the village under the trees and often would be killed by animals or snakes or anything else, hunting for food at night, just because of that ignorance, that lack of understanding. So now they also do education. But, before then, I would have certainly never thought of a woman or a young girl being an outcast simply because she was in her menstrual cycle. And this was not like a long time ago. This is like currently happening. This organization is really growing, and they even in a lot of the educational sessions, they include some of the brothers will come in, or some of the husbands, to better understand this whole thing. I don't know. It was just, in this day and age, it seems incredible that there could be that lack of education, but there is.
So I told a bad story about Jack, so I'm not going to tell a good story about Jack. I think one of the outcasts in America, and this is weird, but the very unattractive people, like the people who are obese and just a lot of times they're alone. And Jack also went through a very long stage where he wanted to hug everyone he saw. And I mean, it took forever to get through a parking lot or a grocery store because he needed to hug everybody. I mean, we got to the point where he would at least ask permission. And then eventually we got to exchanging it for fist bumps and things. But when he was in that thick of that, had to hug everybody, I was just, my little personal sociology experiment. I would watch when he would go up to attractive people at the grocery store and ask them if he could give them a hug. They always gave this look like, what is this? Why is this happening? And so often when he would go up to very unattractive, obese people and ask to give them a hug, it would sometimes move them to tears. And they would say, that's the first person who's hugged me and I don't know how long. And that just made my week, and things like that. And Jack didn't see any difference between them. But so to me, that was an interesting version of who we don't even think about, that we consider outcasts or treat as outcasts here in America.
This is, I don't know if it's on subject or not. I was thinking, you know, the blessing bags that we've handed out. You get different reactions to those, and you know, there's one man that was just so excited about getting that back. He was just he told me, you know, that he was gonna, you know, we had a conversation even at the red light. Yeah, he was going to he was trying to make his way to this place that's a kind of a, it's not necessarily rehab. I have to think of what it was called, but anyway, but it's, you know, a group where, you know, people get together to try to stay on track with staying off of whatever they've been on. And so he was in, this was like, I think that was over in Carrollton, and he was at LBJ and whichever, Skillman, no, that would have been Greenville. Anyway, Forest, probably. Yes. I was on my way to Gateway Grace. I go lots of different ways. And, you know, but I was thinking, you know, it's like we should collect stories of of giving those blessing bags to different people. And I don't know what would come of that, but that was a thought I had. So I had another lady that, you know, she took it and we were at the light. She didn't really, you know, she said thank you and smiled and everything, but then she was just sorting through everything. And it was funny. She, you know, John had put like a $5 bill in there. So she pocketed that, but then she was just, you know, just sorting everything into different groups of things. And I don't know how things got sorted one way or the other, but, you know, it was interesting seeing that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen both. I've seen that as well. And then yesterday, somebody refused one, and I was, and it was my reaction that I was so surprised. I said, "What?" And what? And he was really close to my window, and so then it kind of frightened me. So I said, "Well, are you sure? Are you sure?" And so. That's the first that's happened. But I've had some good conversations with them. I love that somebody was going to get help. And there's that whole trifold, both sides, that show you where you can get help.
I had one who wouldn't accept one either. He had a whole cart full of stuff, you know, and he said, "You need to take it to some of the homeless men up the street." He said, "I have all this stuff." Oh. Okay, just trying to help. I think he covered pretty well. They had a question, who were the Samaritans? I think that Adam Hamilton covered that really well. You know, I typically think in my mind that they're half-breeds, and that's kind of what they were considered. What were some of the key points in Jesus' journey to Jerusalem?
Going back to the Samaritans, though, I never thought of their viewpoint. You know, we always get the Jews that they hate the Samaritans, but, you know, the Samaritans, they looked kind of down on the Jews too, according to Adam Hamilton. So I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah. But I think the stories that were, you know, just him going through all these stories, it's like, okay, this one was while Jesus was thinking ahead to being in Jerusalem and, and being crucified and, just thinking about all that and all these different stories. It's like, wow, that.
Mhm.
And all those outcasts, how do we see Jesus lifting them up?
They were equal.
Never treating them
Right.
as an outcast.
Yeah.
They were seen, when it's before they weren't seen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one thing about the touch is a touch, it's Barbara, I think, said that it's, humanity, but it's also putting yourself on the same level as that person. I mean, unless you like touch them on the head, but it's otherwise it's a connection. We are, we aren't that different, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sandra was saying that babies in orphanages that aren't touched have so many problems.
Fail to thrive.
Yeah. Failure to thrive, yeah. Mhm.
It's Heather again. When I was in elementary school, when the AIDS virus was booming, and the first thing I ever heard about it was, you can't catch AIDS from anything other than a blood transfusion or sexual intercourse, and so you don't have to worry about it. I heard about that before I heard what AIDS was, because that was just preached to us in school over and over and over again. And we were told about the stories of Princess Diana and First Lady Barbara Bush, who were going into the hospitals with the AIDS babies and holding them and just, being examples to the rest of us that they're not going to catch it this way. And so interesting perspective, I guess, that I knew there must be some people who thought otherwise, because that's all we were hearing in school day after day was there's only 3 ways to get it, I guess. It was blood transfusion, sexual intercourse, and through birth. And so, I don't know. I knew that before I knew that there was a stigmatism about it.
Yeah, we had a student at Hickman whose little sister had HIV at that time. She was born with it. Her mother, her dad had already died of AIDS. Mom had AIDS. It was a terrible, terrible thing. But then at that time, they didn't have things that could treat it successfully. So you knew this little girl probably didn't have a very long lifespan. A little hard to think of an innocent child.
I think of all the people in Malawi, that's such a major problem that they're trying to overcome.
In Africa, period.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I said, removing our funds from that organization in Africa, that there were aid drugs there, but there was nobody to administer them to the people. Anyway, sad situation. Okay, he pointed out that Jesus did not take a linear journey to Jerusalem. And I guess I hadn't visualized the map quite the way it was on page 60 in the book. He showed it in the video that one of the ways was going over the Jordan River and then coming back in rather than going through Samaria. What was the significance of the Samaritan man who had leprosy and was healed?
Came back.
He came back.
Yeah.
And Jesus asked, where are the other 9? He was the only one that offered thanksgiving. And in Luke 10, Jesus sends out 72 disciples to the towns and villages of the region, commissioning them, heal the sick who are there, and say to them, God's kingdom has come upon you. I don't think I ever visualized 72 people being disciples, being sent out. The closest is in The Chosen, if you've seen some of those episodes of The Chosen, where there are lots of people traveling with Jesus. But I'm sure I must have read that before, but it never.
I'm glad you said that because I thought I was the only one that didn't know that.
No. So I knew that he sent them out 2 by 2, but I didn't realize there were 36 teams there.
But I don't know that he also said like each disciple and then the other, the other folks with them. So is that groups of 6 then, or is it, I don't know. In the book, he said the disciples then went by themselves and then with these other people. That's what he said, I thought, in the book. So groups of 6, not, I don't know. I don't know which way it would go. Right. So I don't know if it's 6 or 2.
Chosen, it's 6 groups of 2.
What?
In The Chosen, it's 6 groups of 2.
It's 6 groups of 2.
6 groups of 2. Okay. Okay. We had some questions. I'm not locating them in my, here, that's the reason I'm in the wrong book. Okay. What were some of the highlights of if you read the book, what were some of the things on the journey, the highlights that Adam Hamilton pointed out were some of the things? For instance, the religious leaders and others in the crowd claimed that Jesus casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons. That's Luke 11:14 through 26. What are some other instances that they give you in the lesson that they point out of things that happen along the way? Pharisees that criticize. Someone think of anything in particular?
One of the things that struck me, and this may be the next question, but with Martha and Mary, I didn't really realize that this took place on his way to Jerusalem.
I didn't either.
If you put it in that context, it's like, oh, no wonder, it makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, I felt the same way.
Yes. Well, there was Pharisee that criticizes Jesus for not washing his hands before eating. And then Jesus responds with harsh criticism of his own against the Pharisees and the legal experts, saying that you're worried about the cup being clean on the outside, but you're not worried about being clean on the inside.
Karen, that reminds me of the story of a true story of a friend of ours whose son was involved in the Waco group, not Branch Davidians, but the church there. What do you call them? Anyway, he was over there, and it's when they took the hostages. Do you remember? They took the 2 women, and it was all over the news. And he was in that group, and in fact, he tried to trade himself for the women, and they wouldn't do it. Somehow they got the women, and they were coming out, going through a checkpoint in the van, and they had Bibles and all kinds of Christian material in this under the seats, like the benches that were like window benches, and they timed their escape they knew that the people that were guarding it would be eating, and they knew that the people didn't want to shake hands or touch them or anything while they were eating because they're unclean hands. And that's the way they escaped through going through the checkpoint, was the guy, didn't want to get dirty because he was eating. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Name of them in a minute.
Why
who I'm
did-
talking about.
Mhm.
You know who I'm talking about. Gail's son.
Yeah, Gail's son. I knew what that you were talking about.
He's a missionary.
Okay, Pharisees and legal experts began to plot against Jesus in Luke 11:53 and 54 and resent him. Would somebody look that up, please?
$54.
Mhm.
No.
53 and 54.
As soon as Jesus.
Get that.
Oh. As soon as Jesus left the table, the religion scholars and Pharisees went into a rage. They went over and over everything he said, plotting how they could trap him in something from his own mouth. That's from the Message.
Okay.
So it's interesting that right before that, it's like, yes, I tell you, it'll be charged against this generation. Woe to you, lawyers, for you've taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter yourselves, and you hindered those who are entering the kingdom. Basically, I mean, woe. Look in 47. Woe to you, for you build tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. So you are witnesses and approve of the deeds of your ancestors, for they killed them, and you build their tombs. Therefore, I mean, he was going after them.
He was.
Whoa, whoa. Yeah, and I don't think they were lawyer jokes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He also, in Luke 12:1, Jesus teaches the crowd to watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. I mean, the mismatch between their hearts and their lives. Do we have to watch for that with ourselves today?
Ourselves and others.
Yeah, yes, and others. Then in Luke 13:10 through 17 is the one where Jesus heals the woman on the Sabbath. Would somebody like to read that?
What's the citation?
Luke 13:10 through 17.
Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid hands upon her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger, and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, who is a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things he was doing.
Okay, the crowd was rejoicing, but the Pharisees were not. He put them in their place. Can you imagine being in that bent over position for 18 years? Why do you think the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders was increasing about this time?
was in the crowd, there was much rejoicing.
Yeah, that says it all, really,
Yeah, it's threatening to the
threatening
powers
to
that
their
be.
way of life. In what ways do you see Jesus ministering to the outsider, the outcast, and outlaws in these stories? Where and how does he lift up the lowly? In just about every setting.
Yeah.
Well, and he's not worried about the opposition.
Right. That's a good point. He said he's not worried about the opposition.
Got a quiet group online.
Invites them to dinner, that goes to their house for dinner.
Yeah, yes. Who in your community or our world would be critical of Jesus today?
Oh,
Don't go there.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What would they criticize about him?
So I have a friend who I've been friends with for over 60 years. And for better or worse, we had a Facebook conversation. And I brought up that, you know, of course, I mean, this person grew, I mean, like we went to church together. Not to mention, we went steady when I was in 6th grade.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I had his ID bracelet. And I said, and of course, you know, we can't forget that in Luke, you know, Jesus is all about the oppressed and the alien, and also in Deuteronomy. I mean, it's like, and he went all over me for bringing Jesus into the topic. I'd like, but number one, I'm a pastor. And number two, this is what Jesus was about. Now, what that means for us, we have to discern. But you can't deny that that's who he was.
Would the illegal immigrants be considered the outcasts today? They're certainly a hot topic.
Well, and even people that are here legally, you know, that are, yeah.
But if you're an immigrant, you're considered illegal.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Sandra.
Yeah. The problem is that if you don't look like us, then you're considered an
Illegal.
illegal immigrant, really, you know, so.
People make a lot of assumptions, and
Mhm.
it's unfortunate that they've been vilified to such a degree.
Well, and so there's, so the people, you know, anyone who feels like they might be targeted as an immigrant then is not doing all kinds of things, you know. I hear they're not going to church, they're not going to schools, yeah. You're probably not going to the doctors, and yeah, so.
Mm.
Yeah.
Where do you find hope in these stories of Jesus' encounter with the religious leaders and the outsiders and the outcast?
I feel like he did point out that, you know, he was still being invited to dinner by some of the religious leaders. Now, you know, at this point, whether they're trying to trap him or if they're still trying to, you know, make up their own minds,
Figure him out.
then, you know, that you don't know. But, you know that he did get through to some people, some of those religious leaders. So,
At least he piqued their curiosity.
yeah.
All right, Jesus meets, let's look at Luke 17:11-19.
I think someone online said reading.
Good idea. Judy looks ready.
Chapter 17, verses what?
11-19.
Okay. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well."
Oftentimes the Samaritan turns out to be the hero of stories, or certainly important to the story. Jesus meets these men on the border region between Samaria and Galilee. Why is this in-between setting important to understanding the story?
I think because there was a border.
Right.
That's a significant thing of
Apparently,
stepping out of your comfort zone.
yes. Apparently, the others may have been from Galilee, the other lepers. I suppose the fact that they all had leprosy made them a unit, whether they were Samaritan or whether they were Galilean. Have you ever had an important encounter with someone in in-between setting? It's kind of a hard question, I think.
At pilgrimage that went to 2 weeks ago, it's interesting. One of the pastors preached on this story of the 10 lepers, and he said, "No, we always think about how the one did the right thing and the other 9 did the wrong thing, but you never think about why the other 9 didn't come back and think." And like one of them was scared, and one of them had a family that he was so anxious to rush home to that he hadn't seen in so long, and he went off and described what each of the other 9
Could
were
have done.
doing and why they weren't coming back to thank him. It was interesting. I'd never heard that version before. Not sure where he got it from.
Midrash. That would be a midrash.
Midrash.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
What kind of in-between?
So,
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
well, the in-between thing, I think there's a lot of times that we meet people in an in-between place. At surgeries, at diagnoses, at, life changes, even like getting married, it's like that. Doesn't have to be a bad or a potentially threatening thing. It could be a joyous thing. Having a baby, it's going to change everything. You don't know what the new land, what the new territory is going to look like. And yeah, I think, this, when he said it was in between land, in between the lands, it's also in between them being sick and having an excuse to be an outcast, and then having to live into really being healed,
Good
and
point.
going forward, sort of like the guy that was a cripple for 30 years or whatever it was by the pool. Do you want to be healed? And it's like, Well, yeah, I think I do. You know, I mean, if
That
you're going to
is-
ask that way, because then I have
that
to,
identity
yeah, yeah. So that
changed.
I never thought about that this place of geographically, it's not just geographically, it's them in this liminal space, but it's also it's also a mixture of cultures. You
Right.
know, it's you have the Samaritans and the Galileans. So yeah, cool.
I kind of felt like I was in an in-between place in some of my schools that I have been assigned to. When I was in Booker T. Washington, I definitely felt that way, having grown up in a segregated town, never going to school with Black people until we were in college, and then being thrust in a school that's entirely Black, except for some young teachers like me who were put in that position. It was a very big learning experience and a valuable one to me, but I considered that an in-between setting because it put me in way out of my comfort zone.
It wasn't a magnet then?
No, it was not a magnet. It was an elementary school for about 5 or 6 years, and I taught there. And anyway, it was a learning experience all the way around. It was. I learned some very valuable things that would come in handy later in my education experience.
To Ellen's point about a marriage being an in-between, my husband and I got married, and we came from different cultures, different socioeconomic groups, different languages, different sides of the Mason-Dixon. I mean, there was just so much different that we had to learn to be the in-between and, find a way to balance those two cultures. And I mean, I feel like we have over the last 30 years, but I think we've both gotten good things from each other's family and move
Yeah.
forward.
We
But
learn from each other,
we do.
or you should.
Yeah.
Anyone else have that experience, Pam?
Yeah, the very first nursing home that I was the administrator of was in Austin, Texas. And I went up there with a friend of mine who I had worked with and had been an administrator. And we went up on a Sunday, and I wanted to see the facility before I started and all that. And it was pouring down rain, and we went up there on a Sunday. We went all through it, and we were coming back, and I was driving, and it was still pouring down rain. And I said, "So what do you think?" And Arlene was from England and had only been stateside, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And she said, "So is it going to bother you that you're the only white person there?" I'm like, "What?" And I said, "I'm the only white person there." And she said, "Yeah." She said, "I think there was one of the residents was white." And she said there seemed to be quite a few Mexican Americans, but most everyone there was Black. It was like, no. No. And so we drove on, and she said, "So do you think it's going to bother them that you're coming as the administrator and you're not Black or Hispanic?" And I said, "Well, of course not. Of course not." Well, truth be known, there was one gentleman who was white. It was the same mix that she had seen. It didn't bother me, but the secretary it was her mother that had previously been the owner, and the lady I worked for had recently purchased this nursing home. And she said to me about 6 weeks in, she said, "People don't know whether to trust you or not." And they were really surprised that one day they noticed you had a cross around your neck. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, because you're white." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Well, most of my folk believe that white people really aren't Christians, that they just wear crosses but they don't really mean it." And I remember like falling into the chair by her desk, and it's like, I was so confused. I said, "I've never heard of, why would they think that?" And she said, "Well, because white people go to churches, but then they come out and they don't act like Christians. And that's how a lot of my generations have been able to understand like why a lot of the things have happened through the years is because there really wasn't that faith. But I don't know, I still remember that conversation that day.
That's
And even
sad.
now retelling it, it kind of gives me goosebumps, and it almost like, I don't know, kind of makes my stomach funny because that's just, I mean, she just said it so not matter of factly, so honestly, but I was there for quite a while, and it was a learning experience for all of us, but it probably was really a life defining moment and shaped my whole life about a lot of things.
I know we're running out of time, but
Oh, sorry, my stories are always
that was, thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm,
That does happen.
yeah.
How commonly do you think people make moral assumptions about people who have been marginalized? They made moral assumption about you, Pam, based on your color.
Sometimes the moral judgments or whatever they just need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. That they're somehow lazy or whatever. And sometimes that can be accurate. And sometimes it's not. Yeah.
I had one incident with blessing bags. I was going around, and I won't use names, but I was going around our church trying to get people to come make blessing bags. And I invited this one gentleman to come do it. And he said, "No, I'm not interested. I just want them to get off the street corners." And I thought, well, how are they going to do it if we don't help? And I think, again, it was that judgment. And it was a good reminder when we used to volunteer at Austin Street that it could be any of us tomorrow. You know, you have some crippling medical debt, you lose your job, you have mental illness, whatever. We're all one paycheck away from potentially being in the same position. And I think that's important for us to remember for those people that are down and out.
Thank you for pointing that out, Victoria. There's one last section, and I just want us to think about. He asked a lot of questions about giving thanks, and because of the one leper who came back and gave thanks, and the 9 who did not. How do we express thankfulness? I'm not going to spend much time on it, just as a thought that we need to take with us, that we need to think about that. And how do we encourage other people to give thanks? In what ways does your congregation give thanks to God together? We have so much to be thankful for.
We're woven together in gratitude.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And
in the atrium, you can see it.
At the very end of the journey, as Jesus draws near Jericho, we find a familiar story of Jesus welcoming the children. If someone would read this 3 verses, Luke 18:15 through 17. It's very familiar to us.
People were bringing even infants to him that he might touch them. And when the disciples saw it, they sternly ordered them not to do it. But Jesus called for them and said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it."
And they just wanted us to think about the importance of children in our community. We know how much personally our children and our grandchildren, nieces and nephews are important to us, but, and I think we're in a really good place in our church right now with our children's ministry. We're really sorry to lose Kate, but I have every hope that Wendy will carry on. But I think we're doing the right thing right now. Does anyone have any joys or concerns we need to